On January 5, 1942, while the streets of Tokyo rang with jubilant cries of victory, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to start preparations for the next phase of the Pacific War. Reviewing the reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and regions further south, he concluded that within a few months, Japanese forces would have taken control of East Asia and the other territories attacked in December. He told his chief of staff, Mato Megaki, that he expected the plans to be ready by mid-February. The rapid success in the Western Pacific had astonished Tokyo's planners and sparked fierce debate within the Imperial General Staff. The fervent military nationalists argued for relentless advance while Japan remained on the offensive, regardless of the strategic risks. Yamamoto, in contrast, had long been wary of war with the United States and Britain, and he worried about the long-term outcome. Partly for his protection, he was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato, since colleagues on the General Staff feared assassination due to his outspoken caution about unlimited war. Even at that moment, his views were well known to those around him. In his diary, Admiral Igaki emphasized the need for foresight after this first month of triumph, a warning Yamamoto often voiced, insisting Japan could not fight the Western powers and expect enduring success. Yamamoto's public criticism of politicians was directed at figures like Prince Kono, who seemed uncertain about the kind of war Japan should wage in the Pacific. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, he had met Ryuichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kokusudo organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Warning that war had become inevitable due to political choices, he told Sasakawa that at first, "We will have everything our own way, spreading out like an octopus, its tentacles extending far and wide." A month into the conflict, that octopus had nearly flattened across the region. Yet Yamamoto had cautioned that the initial euphoria would not last. The key moment for political action, he said, would come when Singapore fell, a defeat that would shake the British in India and make them more receptive to peace talks. Yamamoto knew the British well from his participation in the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934, and he understood the Americans, having served as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He agreed that once war had begun, a swift and decisive victory was essential. But after achieving it, he believed Japan would have only about a year and a half to savor its triumph. "We must secure a peace agreement within that time," he told Sasakawa, counting on his friend to convey this message to the right-wing political leaders then in power. By January 5, victory appeared within reach. The American battleship fleet had been disabled at Pearl Harbor on December 7. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off the coast of Malaya. Manila and the U.S. naval base at Cavite had fallen to Japanese forces. The British had surrendered Hong Kong, and Japanese troops were advancing toward new landings in the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul on New Ireland, Amboyna, and the Solomon Islands. The attack on Pearl Harbor, however, had fallen short of Yamamoto's full ambitions. The main elements of the United States fleet remained intact. The aircraft carriers, which had been at sea during the assault, were unscathed and continued to pose a significant threat. What Yamamoto sought was a truly spectacular victory, yet he did not anticipate the fall of Singapore for another 5 or 6 months. It ultimately fell on February 15. He understood that, to create the conditions for negotiation, Japan would need to shift its focus. But the pressing question for his planners was where to strike next. The army rejected Yamamoto's proposal to attack the Soviet Union, a campaign that would have been fought largely on land while the army remained heavily engaged in China and Southeast Asia. This left 3 alternative options. Yamamoto's preferred course was an offensive in the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, draw out the British Far Eastern Fleet, and destroy it as he had destroyed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, then push into the Middle East to link with the Germans advancing toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. In this way, the Japanese Navy would secure the oil it desperately needed. The army, however, refused to entertain any plan involving the Middle East. 2 possibilities remained. 1, championed by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, envisioned an attack on Australia to deny the Americans a forward base. After advancing through the Solomon Islands, the Navy would take New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Proponents in Imperial General Headquarters were already preparing occupation systems for Australia and New Zealand. Yamamoto, however, rejected the Australia plan, believing it would be too slow and insufficiently striking to halt American retaliation. He was also aware that the attack on Pearl Harbor had ignited a fierce desire for revenge in the Americans, a people the Japanese had long considered soft and ineffectual, at least according to the army. Even the capture of Singapore, he realized, would not stop them. Yamamoto sought a victory that would allow Japan to extend a generous olive branch. In January, he ordered the drafting of a new plan, and 2 months later sent officers to Tokyo with the MI plan, which envisioned a decisive battle off Midway Island to destroy the American carrier force. Alongside it, he dispatched the AL plan, detailing an invasion of North America via Alaska. Success at Midway and in the Aleutians would, at the very least, provide the politicians with a base from which to negotiate the kind of peace Yamamoto desired. In Tokyo, admirals argued fiercely around the Navy Ministry conference table, yet Yamamoto ultimately prevailed. The potential significance of Singapore's fall in February, as well as the looming collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, which might have served his strategic purposes, was largely set aside. Their diminished importance became evident after Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's April raid on Tokyo, which starkly reminded the Japanese that the Americans were only beginning to fight. By June, following the disastrous Midway operation, there was no time for recrimination. The Army remained unaware of the full scale of the defeat, as the destruction of 4 fleet carriers was tightly controlled information, known only to the Navy's highest echelons. Meanwhile, while Yamamoto was engaged with the Midway operation, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo continued advancing southward, preparing for the planned effort to isolate Australia. Naval forces had seized Rabaul on January 23, and from that point onward, they conducted continuous reconnaissance and bombing raids against the surrounding islands and New Guinea. It became clear to the Australians, who shared their concerns with General Douglas MacArthur upon his arrival in March, that the Japanese were likely to move against New Guinea. A successful campaign that could almost effortlessly open the way for a Japanese advance into northern Australia. In February, Japanese bombers had already struck Darwin, and in March, with the invasion of Salamaua, New Guinea, the tempo of their operations accelerated. In May, just before the Battle of Midway, the Japanese dispatched an occupation force toward Port Moresby, only to be repelled by the determined defense of American and Australian forces during the carrier battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese did, however, occupy Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, establishing a seaplane base. The engagement at the Coral Sea convinced planners in Washington and Canberra that they needed to prepare for further Japanese moves in the South Pacific. MacArthur warned the Australian government to be ready for an attack, even as the main Japanese thrust was widely expected against India. He requested 2 carriers and 1,000 planes from General Marshall. In Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed Marshall that until the end of June, only 2 carriers would be operational in the Pacific, while the Japanese counted 10 on the eve of Midway. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already issued warnings about the major operation he anticipated from the Japanese, which ultimately materialized at Midway. While events unfolded at Midway, Japanese forces were consolidating in the New Guinea, Solomon Islands area. Major General Tomitaro Hori landed the South Seas Force at Salamaua, while naval troops occupied La and began constructing an air base. Independent of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake received orders to advance toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, remaining ready to resume the push against Port Moresby by July, once Yamamoto and his combined fleet returned. This large carrier force was expected to cover the operation. Despite the setback at Midway, which was reported to field forces as a victory, Imperial General Headquarters did not revise its plans. Within days, the Australians informed MacArthur that the Japanese were prepared to advance. Riding the perceived Midway triumph, MacArthur proposed that the Allies launch a preemptive strike on the New Britain, New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the principal Japanese naval and air base. With 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division, MacArthur believed he could push the Japanese back to Truk. On June 12, General Marshall presented MacArthur's proposal to Admiral King, with modifications: 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions for the assaults. King opposed the plan, objecting to placing MacArthur in operational command. He also argued that the carriers would be exposed to land-based attacks and would lack adequate protection, challenges the Navy would later confront at Guadalcanal. King devised an alternative, an advance from the New Hebrides under Navy command. MacArthur resisted the idea of subordinating his army forces to the Navy, yet none could deny the urgency of halting the Japanese before they captured New Guinea and threatened Australia. The central question for the Joint Chiefs of Staff remained unresolved: who would command the operation? Phase 1, the primary objective of capturing the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and nearby positions, was assigned to Admiral King. Guadalcanal, at the time, was just a dot on the map, with no recognized tactical or strategic value. It did not even receive a name in the Joint Chiefs of Staff plan. General MacArthur was given a consolation prize. After Phase 1, he would assume command to mop up Japanese forces in the remainder of the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea. King was granted control because the Joint Chiefs recognized that he had already devised a defensive line through the Pacific to protect Australia, a plan requiring comparatively fewer resources than MacArthur's. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had persuaded General Arnold to send several U.S. Army Air Force squadrons there. He reinforced Samoa and Afata in the New Hebrides and planned to establish a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose earlier indecision during the Wake Island crisis had frustrated King, was reassigned to the newly created Amphibious Training Command in San Diego. He, along with Marine Major General Holland Smith, was tasked with developing new techniques for island warfare. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief planning officer, outlined a staged strategy. First, to hold the line in the South Pacific while training the amphibious forces. Second, a combined offensive by the United States, Australia, and New Zealand through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and Admiralty Islands. Third, the seizure of the Caroline and Marshall Islands. And fourth, a push toward either the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. King approved the plan, as it closely matched his own vision. He arranged for Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, then serving as a naval observer in London, to take command of the South Pacific Force. Turner was detached from the plan's division and ordered to prepare to lead the amphibious operations. All of these arrangements were completed even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1. Though he would officially take command on June 19, he first had to report to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, his direct superior. By the time Gormley arrived in Hawaii, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific was already underway. On May 22, an Army plane spotted a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographing Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suspected the Japanese intended to build an airfield on the island. By June 25, reports indicated that the grass on the central plain had been burned off and tents were erected. A wharf was under construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher reported that airfield construction awaited only the arrival of Japanese engineering units, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American CB units. This was confirmed through a radio interception by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's radio intelligence team, having partially broken the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message stating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive on July 4. Fleet intelligence quickly connected the dots. Admiral Turner happened to be at Pearl Harbor that day, en route to prepare for an amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. Upon receiving the radio intelligence report, he immediately realized the destination. It could be nowhere but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner arrived in Wellington and boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, formerly the Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His mission was daunting: to train an entire amphibious task force in just 1 month. As Turner began organizing ships and personnel, Admiral Gormley traveled to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley departed New Zealand with a mind weighed down by doubts over the folly of attempting an amphibious operation when no one truly knew how to conduct one. MacArthur, who had his own reservations about the plan, fully agreed. They also concluded that, with the aircraft available, the landing could not be guaranteed adequate air cover. This meeting took place on July 18, with the landing scheduled just 3 weeks away. A dispatch was sent back to Washington recommending that the operation be postponed. King, however, was displeased. He had warned his new commander that the task ahead would be difficult and that proper resources might not be available until perhaps the fall. His answer was unequivocal: the invasion would go ahead as planned. Gormley had left Washington convinced that the United States was ill-prepared for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His apprehension deepened when his requests for CBs and other units to be sent immediately to New Zealand were denied. From the outset, the Guadalcanal invasion plan suffered from intelligence failures. Commands were aware that an operation was imminent, especially after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz issued Gormley his operational orders. The main Japanese air base was at Rabaul. Aircraft from there could stop at Guadalcanal to refuel before striking Australia, posing a severe threat to Allied buildup. Yet on July 10, Allied intelligence reaching King included only a casual mention of airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and a few days later a report mislocated the airfield on the wrong side of the island. By the end of July, the Japanese had completed the airfield. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Yamamoto ordered that the first stage mission would depart from Rabaul on August 14. As overall commander of the U.S. operation, Gormley struggled to secure additional support, build advanced bases, and bring in more aircraft. But at every turn, he confronted the reality of Admiral King's warning: proper resources would not be forthcoming. Supplies for the invasion forces, for example, were loaded in haphazard fashion aboard transports at Oakland. Although docks capable of unloading and reloading in organized sequence were available, the ships were sent to Noumea, which lacked such facilities. King was at least aware, in general terms, of the logistical challenges, but there was no time for delay. He understood better than anyone the urgent necessity of halting the Japanese advance before they reached Australia. The timetable remained fixed. By late July, the rush was on. 17,000 Marines were moving by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa. Gormley was too preoccupied to convene a full conference of his commanders, but on July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, designated for tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders gathered to discuss the invasion. Fletcher was to protect the landing with his task force, while Turner would deliver Marine troops under General Alexander Vandegrift. After the Marines secured the island, garrison troops would follow. Yet the operation had been planned in such haste that no provisions were made for reserve troops. The South Pacific simply had no additional forces available. The meeting aboard the Saratoga was tense from the start. Fletcher opened by declaring that he would cover the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff present agreed, that the carriers could not be risked. Fletcher was cautious to the point of paranoia. He called the entire operation hasty, ill-conceived, and doomed to fail. Admiral Turner, who had a broader understanding of the global military picture than anyone else in the room, reprimanded his superior. Arguing over the plan was pointless, he said. The decision to risk everything had already been made. Their duty was to execute orders. Fletcher ought to have known this. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so dissatisfied with Fletcher's habitual reluctance to engage the enemy that he instructed Admiral Nimitz to assess Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz, a fair-minded officer who respected Fletcher, had given him a pep talk, and after Midway, Fletcher had performed adequately in command. Yet on the eve of America's first offensive, warning the landing forces and support ships that he would withdraw in 48 hours was an ominous beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion took place on July 28 and lasted 3 days, on Koro Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops made it ashore, and once there, they were uncertain what to do. General Van de Grift judged the exercise a complete failure, but there was no time to reconsider. By July 31st, the Marines were back aboard the transports, en route to Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6th, as the 75-ship task force approached the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously pulled his carriers aside. He would launch air cover as promised, but the 26 carriers were kept as far from danger as possible. If American intelligence had been lax enough to allow the Japanese to complete their airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was even more blind. As the U.S. invasion fleet gathered in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no hint of the impending attack. In July 1942, the Japanese Army focused on capturing New Guinea as a base for operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Force landed 2,000 troops near Buna. Following the capture of Buna, the Japanese planned to build airfields as a springboard for a renewed assault on Port Moresby. During July, Japanese air power concentrated on Port Moresby, with bombers and fighters striking piers and airfields almost daily. After their landings, Japanese air units were called upon to support the beachhead, and in early August, their attention remained fixed on this new offensive. The combined Australian and American air forces responded with raids on Japanese airfields at La. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, the Yamato, was anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. Leisurely, he prepared for upcoming air operations against Australia, awaiting the next developments. In preparation, on August 3, Japanese naval air groups stationed at La were recalled to Rabaul to ready themselves for the Guadalcanal operations scheduled for the following week. During the first week of August, cloudy skies limited Japanese aerial reconnaissance in the South Pacific. Only a few search planes took to the air, and none detected the American armada advancing toward Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots flying from Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft near Buna. Believing the U.S. carriers had been destroyed at Midway, they assumed these planes were operating alongside Australian forces that had traversed the Owen Stanley Mountains. In reality, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field anticipated an impending invasion. After 8 months of uninterrupted victories, it was difficult for the Japanese to imagine that the Allies could mount a seaborne assault. Had the notion been suggested, they would likely have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an operation had little chance of success. As a result, the American Expeditionary Force advanced toward Guadalcanal with complete surprise on its side. On August 4th and 5th, the 75-ship fleet steamed beneath overcast skies, and on August 6th, it navigated through rain squalls for much of the day. When dawn broke on August 7th, the sky had cleared, ensuring good visibility for carrier aircraft to conduct their missions. At 5:30 a.m., the fleet went to general quarters. By 6 o'clock, the carriers launched their first strikes. Aircraft from the Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were linked by a causeway. Japanese aircraft had been grounded the day before due to bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported a single unidentified aircraft during the day, though it was unclear whether it was Japanese or part of MacArthur's command. The Japanese, however, were not alerted until 6:12 a.m., when the Tulagi Seaplane Base Communications Headquarters sent a frantic message of attack to the 4th, 6th, and 8th Fleets, as well as to Admiral Yamamoto and Imperial Headquarters. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. With clear skies, carrier planes flew into scattered cumulus clouds beneath the light of a quarter moon. Fighters and bombers proceeded to their assigned missions. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L. H. Bauer took off from the Enterprise to target Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. Finding no aircraft or PT boats, they strafed the buildings on Lunga Point Airfield. Meanwhile, Another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol over the transport ships from 6 to 8 o'clock, relieved in rotation by others. Bombers began striking Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, encountering no Japanese air opposition throughout the morning. The Americans dominated the skies. The only aircraft losses resulted from operational accidents. Planes from the other carriers attacked the seaplane base at Gavutu. The element of surprise was total. American aircraft bombed and strafed seaplanes moored in the water, destroying 9 floatplanes similar to Zero's, a 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes used as both bombers and reconnaissance craft. Any Japanese pilots attempting to take off were shot down before becoming airborne. Not a single plane at Gavutu survived the assault. Other carrier aircraft targeted Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi, striking beaches that the Marines would soon invade. Before dawn, Marines aboard the transports could see the high mountains of their objective island. The ships slipped through the narrow channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Seal Arc Channel. As dawn broke, escorting warships opened fire, their flashes illuminating the fleet. There was virtually no return fire. Cruisers and destroyers accompanying the transports began bombarding the shore, igniting fires along the coastline. An oil dump exploded, sending flames skyward. By 8 a.m., after 2 hours of bombing and shelling, the landing craft began moving toward the north shore, just east of Lunga Point. The Marines were tense. Neither they nor their officers had practical experience in amphibious landings, as this was America's first such invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9 a.m., troops began landing on Guadalcanal. They met no opposition. The Japanese had withdrawn into the hills. Progress was astonishingly easy. The Marines quickly realized how completely they had taken the enemy by surprise. They discovered wooden barracks that had never been used and a tent with a breakfast table laden with platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. Half-eaten bowls of rice were scattered around, chopsticks left on tables or straw mats. The tents themselves told the story of the Japanese retreat. Many were torn by shrapnel, and some had been flattened by naval shelling before the landing. Yet any Marine who felt inclined to celebrate the ease of the early objectives would soon face a reality check. While the Japanese on Guadalcanal had been caught off guard and had not yet dug in or established permanent fortifications, most were construction troops rather than combat soldiers. On Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines met stiff resistance. About 250 Japanese troops held the island. They were members of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment, under Captain Shigetoshi Miyazaki, seasoned and committed fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders were among the toughest American units in the Pacific, all volunteers selected from a force renowned for its combat ability. The Raider concept had been inspired by Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation to create a commando force, drawing on Carlson's experience serving several months with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla struggle against the Japanese in North China. Edson's raiders had trained for months under Spartan conditions and arrived at Guadalcanal with a formidable reputation. They would soon need every skill they had acquired, and learn new ones under fire. This operation marked the first encounter between highly trained American troops and experienced Japanese veterans since the war began in December. The Japanese had gained a fearsome reputation through their rapid campaigns in the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had celebrated these victories, and much of the world came to see the Japanese as invincible, a reputation the Imperial High Command actively promoted. Tulagi thus became the first real test. Edson's men landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwest part of the island. Initially, progress seemed only slightly more difficult than on Guadalcanal. They encountered minor resistance from a few outposts. The northwest of Tulagi was dense jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with sharp thorns. At first, the terrain appeared the biggest obstacle. Only one Marine was lost to sniper fire as the men reached the beach. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge running the length of the island and then advance along the ridgeline, clearing slopes southward. The terrain, however, proved so challenging that it took 3 hours to cut through 1.5 miles of rising ground. Upon reaching the ridge, the Marines emerged from the jungle and came directly into the central Japanese defenses on the hillside. The Japanese had built dugouts and rock embrasures, positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire. Their defense relied on keeping attackers below them. The Marines, however, discovered that by crawling up the cliffs, they could drop dynamite and grenades into the dugouts, a tactic they had to use to advance. Even after a dugout was destroyed, danger remained. In one hole, 17 Japanese soldiers were killed with dynamite. A Marine spotted a radio inside and went to retrieve it, only to be shot along with another man by the 2 remaining Japanese defenders before they were killed. One section of Marines engaged the central defensive positions on the island while the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. Yet even along the ridgeline, progress was difficult. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. Frontal resistance was tough, but with the Japanese, it was only half the challenge. Snipers seemed omnipresent, tied in trees, perched atop buildings, or hidden behind rocks. A favored sniper tactic was to allow the forward element of a Marine unit to pass, then fire from behind. This almost always meant the sniper would die, but not before inflicting several casualties. The first raiders learned quickly that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifles and machine guns were more likely to wound than to kill, an outcome the Japanese considered effective, as it required additional troops and resources to care for the injured. That afternoon, the raiders advanced along the ridge until they encountered a 3-sided ravine whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls and established overlapping fields of fire, tactics that would become familiar in the months ahead. As the Marines moved up, they ran into crossfire, and Edson halted the advance as darkness approached. It was too dangerous to probe unknown hazards at night. That evening brought a new experience. Knowing they were outnumbered and facing certain death, the Japanese staged a desperate counterattack. Around 10:30 p.m., they broke through between 2 companies and surrounded one unit. Marines fought from foxholes and open ground using rifles, machine guns, grenades, and knives. The Japanese pressed along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post, coming within 50 yards. The Marines eventually overpowered the attackers, but one company lost half its non-commissioned officers. The following day, August 8th, additional troops were landed on Tulagi, bringing the total to 7,500 on that side of Sealark Channel. Edson's raiders, along with the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines, resumed their advance toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they cleared dug-in machine gun positions along the steep sides of the old cricket field. From one cave, they removed 35 dead Japanese, some already decaying, others recently killed in the final moments of defending the position. From these encounters, the Americans correctly deduced that the Japanese tactic was to hold a position to the last man unless ordered to retreat, a testament to the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were primarily Labor Battalion members, not frontline combat soldiers. That second day, the raiders encountered numerous examples of a spirit they had not seen before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who shared a single loaded pistol. As the Marines prepared for the final assault, 3 shots rang out. Entering the dugout, they found 3 dead bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then killed his 2 companions and himself. In those early days, this willingness to die rather than surrender shocked the Marines. It was difficult for Americans to comprehend that cornered or wounded men, facing overwhelming enemy forces, would nearly always choose death over capture. After a few Japanese feigned surrender only to attack or detonate grenades, the Marines adjusted to dealing with the Japanese on their terms. From that point, virtually no further attempt was made to convince Japanese soldiers to surrender. By the second day, Tulagi was under American control, though not all Japanese troops had been killed. In the days that followed, Japanese snipers continued to harass the Marines until the last sniper was eliminated. The stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi can be illustrated by the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He had moved ahead of his men to assault a cave near the cricket field, from which the Japanese had been firing sporadically. Closing in, he threw hand grenades into the cave. The Marines had been trained to pull the ring pin, throw, count slowly, and hear the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin, threw the grenade, and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The grenade was thrown back out of the cave, and he had to duck to avoid the blast of his own weapon. After a second identical experience, he tried holding the grenade for 3 seconds, counting 4, 5, 6, and it was ejected again. Goss then called for a satchel charge, a bag of dynamite used to demolish buildings. He thrust the charge into the cave, primed it, and stepped back. The Japanese pushed it out of the cave's mouth, and the dynamite exploded, sending a rock splinter into Goss's leg. Though the wound was not serious, it enraged him. He grabbed his submachine gun, rushed in, and sprayed the cave with fire, killing 4 Japanese and finding 8 more already dead. If anything, the fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was even more intense. The landings there occurred mid-morning, with only small forces initially committed, since few expected many Japanese troops. Yet with the seaplane base on these islands, the Japanese had fortified their positions, creating immediate resistance. The first wave encountered rifle fire only, as the defenders were still reeling from the earlier bombardment and air attacks that had destroyed their seaplanes. By the second wave, Japanese positions about 500 yards inland unleashed intense fire. The third wave faced deadly resistance even before reaching the shore, resulting in heavy casualties. Gavutu and Tanambogo were dominated by small hills, each less than 150 feet high, yet the elevation gave the Japanese positions an advantage over the landings. They were well supplied with machine guns, automatic rifles, and ammunition, and, as on Tulagi, each position had to be seized. The defenders did not retreat, and the intensity of combat on Tanambogo was almost unbelievable. During the early landings, the Marines deployed tanks. The Japanese surged toward the Tanambogo dock, trying to stop them with crowbars, grenades, and gasoline-soaked rags. One tank commander killed 23 Japanese with the tank's machine gun before an enemy soldier climbed the vehicle and stabbed him to death. Another Japanese threw gasoline-soaked rags inside, setting the tank ablaze. By mid-afternoon, it was clear the Marines needed reinforcements. A unit previously landed on Florida Island, where no Japanese were present, was sent to assist at Tanambogo. Though Florida Island had been secured, the Marines could not take the causeway connecting the 2 smaller islands. The reinforcements were directed to Tanambogo and, at dusk, received a 5-minute preparatory bombardment from naval vessels. Unfortunately, one of the last shells struck a fuel dump near the beach, illuminating the shore as if it were midday. Advancing Marines were silhouetted against the sea, making them easy targets for the defenders. From dugouts on the hills, Japanese machine gun and rifle fire swept the beach. 2 boatloads of Marines landed, but the coxswain of a third boat was killed at his tiller, causing the vessel to spin and retreat. Subsequent boats followed, thinking orders had changed. The men in the 2 boats found themselves stranded on the shore, their only cover the concrete pier. Japanese fire raked their position, and as soon as the Americans returned fire, the tracers revealed their location. Several men were hit, and 1 boat withdrew, carrying the wounded. It took some time before the confusion subsided and the remaining boats could begin landing. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack on the beach. Captain Crane, leading his unit, was cut off from his boat. He and 5 men hid in the underbrush, slipping away under the cover of darkness, and returned to the beach once the Japanese had fallen back to their hillside positions. They were eventually rescued, but it was not until 4 a.m. on August 8 that another unit landed and secured the causeway. When the fighting began, 500 Japanese defended the connecting islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. By the time it ended, there were none left. Early on August 7, the Tulagi radio station transmitted the first news of the American assault to Rabaul. The message reached the Rabaul airfield as pilots were preparing early morning missions to harass Australian forces in New Guinea. Orders were immediately cancelled, and all available planes were redirected to attack the American invasion force. Before they could take off, news came from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed, and contact with the base was lost, signaling its capture. At 8:30 a.m., a formation of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers took off from Rabaul. They had been loaded for strikes against Australian positions on New Guinea, carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. 18 fighter escorts accompanied them. Climbing to 13,000 feet, they flew east to Buka Island and then south along the Bougainville coast. Shortly after 1 p.m., 4 Enterprise fighters spotted the formation above Florida Island. Flying at 18,000 feet, they attacked. Lieutenant V. P. Dupoix shot down 1 bomber, and 4 others were damaged and listed as probable kills. When the Zeros joined the fight, the F4Fs were forced to break off into cloud cover as instructed. 1 F4F was shot down, and Lieutenant Dupoix's plane was so damaged he made an emergency landing on the Wasp. Lieutenant G. E. Fairbairn led a flight of 6 fighters from the Enterprise and encountered enemy forces off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros attacked 3 of the F4Fs, all of which were shot down. The remaining 3 American fighters targeted the bombers, with Ensign R. N. Disk shooting down 1 Betty. Radio electrician T. W. Rhodes scored the first Zero kill, but the Zeros pursued in force, forcing the F4Fs to dive into clouds to escape. The Zeros, obeying the Japanese rule never to lose sight of their wingmen, attacked from the starboard quarter. Lieutenant Fairbairn, enlisted pilot W. S. Stevenson Jr., and pilot machinist W. H. Warden were all shot down. A coast watcher rescued Fairbairn from the water off Santa Isabel Island, and another sent a canoe to recover Warden, but Stevenson was never found. On the other carriers, the air battles were equally intense. Bombers proved easier targets, and 6 fighters from Flight 323 engaged enemy bombers off Lunga Point, shooting down 4. Machinist D. C. Runyon personally destroyed 2 of them. Just after 2:30 p.m., as the Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters began their run over the islands, coast watchers were on alert. Paul Edward Mason, a copper planter in peacetime, was stationed on Malabita Hill on Bougainville, overlooking Bin. At 9 a.m., he sent a message reporting that 24 Japanese bombers were heading toward Guadalcanal. When broadcast back from Pearl Harbor to the fleet, they were still 400 miles away, roughly 2¼ hours from their target. The invasion fleet received the message in plenty of time to prepare. HMAS Canberra, an Australian cruiser, reacted typically. When the warning came, the boatswain's mate piped the message. "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 o'clock." The torpedo bombers arrived right on schedule. U.S. fighters climbed to 20,000 feet as the bombers approached the north shore of Guadalcanal, casting eyes over the invasion fleet. At noon, the American carrier fighters and shipboard guns were ready. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese felt the effects of an effective counterattack. The American fighters were highly effective against the twin-engine bombers. Of the 24 Bettys that reached Guadalcanal, all but 1 were shot down, and the only damage sustained was to the destroyer Mugford, hit by a single bomb. Against the Zero fighters, however, the situation was more challenging. Pilot Officer Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading ace, was among 18 elite pilots chosen for this long-range mission. The Japanese formation was engaged by F4F Wildcats from the carriers, which targeted the bombers directly, largely ignoring the Zeros. The Zeros initially protected the bombers, then turned to confront the American fighters. Sakai was puzzled by the American tactics. Navy pilots would dive on the Zeros, and if they missed on the first pass, they scattered and evaded. Their intelligence officers had trained them well, aware of the Zero's superior turning and climbing ability, as well as its speed. After a fierce, skillful battle, Sakai shot down 1 F4F and an SBD dive bomber that had alone engaged 4 Zeros. Several other Japanese pilots scored kills, while 1 Zero was lost. Sakai then attacked a group of SBD torpedo bombers, mistaking them for fighters, and flew straight into 4 rear gunners' machine guns. His Zero was badly damaged, and he was seriously wounded, yet he managed to fly back to Rabaul and land before collapsing. In the air, the Japanese temporarily retained an advantage thanks to the Zero, but American pilots were beginning to exploit the aircraft's limitations. Control of the skies was clearly going to be fiercely contested. At this moment, the Americans held the advantage of proximity, with carriers close offshore, while the Japanese had the numerical advantage at Rabaul. Yet the American effort was hampered by the Zero's superior speed and maneuverability. The F4F Wildcat was not as fast or agile as the Zero, but it had sturdy construction and armor protection, which helped keep American losses comparatively low. At Rabaul, the Japanese quickly recovered from the shock of the American invasion. However, their fighter pilots faced a major challenge: the 1,100-mile round trip to Guadalcanal. For this reason, on the first day, Commander Nakajima, leader of the fighter squadron, resisted higher authorities' demands to send all available Zeros into combat. He dispatched only his most experienced pilots. Soon, additional pilots would be sent, and losses grew more serious, largely due to the immense distances they had to cover. By nightfall on the first day, the U.S. invasion appeared secure. American forces had advanced near the airfield without encountering significant resistance. One prisoner captured revealed there were only about 600 combat troops on the island, along with 1,400 laborers, most of whom had fled to the far side. Admiral Turner had landed 11,000 Marines, with vast piles of ammunition, food, and other supplies crowding the beaches. General Vandegrift noted that the beach forces struggled to organize all the supplies, but he was glad to see them continue arriving, fearing that the carriers would soon depart. A second beachhead was established, but it soon became as crowded as the first. At 8:40 a.m. on August 8th, Coast Watcher Jack Reed at Buka Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers taking off from Caving. 30 minutes later, the message was broadcast from Pearl Harbor to the ships. Carrier planes intercepted the enemy and destroyed many of the bombers, but the U.S. ships were not unharmed. A flaming bomber crashed into the deck of the transport George F. Elliott, setting it ablaze, and another dive bomber torpedoed the destroyer Jarvis, putting it out of action. That morning, pilots from the Enterprise and other carriers took off and found the skies clear. They strafed and bombed Japanese troop concentrations along the Tenaru River and struck the airfield again. Around 10 a.m., 3 fighters from the Enterprise spotted Japanese torpedo bombers approaching low over the water to attack the transports. The Americans engaged immediately. Machinist Runyon shot down 1 bomber and 1 fighter. Ensign V. H. Rouse shot down 2 twin-engine torpedo bombers, and Ensign J. D. Shoemaker down another. This concluded the air activity for the day. By nightfall, the Enterprise's Fighting Six counted its losses, 6 pilots shot down by Zeros. The Japanese still held the advantage in experience and aircraft, but American pilots were beginning to learn the subtleties of aerial combat. The commander of the Enterprise Air Group noted 2 main weaknesses of the Zero: limited firepower and low tolerance for damage. U.S. pilots were instructed to stick close together and, when attacked, to execute a scissors maneuver, turning toward each other. This allowed the F4F pairs to concentrate their firepower on the enemy while relying on the aircraft's sturdiness to absorb punishment. On the ground, Marines faced fierce Japanese resistance on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. On Tulagi, they suffered 90 casualties but secured the island by the end of the second day. The Japanese garrison of 250 men fought to the last. 200 were killed, 3 surrendered, and the remainder swam to Florida Island to continue fighting. On Gavutu and Tanambogo, Marines incurred 250 casualties, while the 500-man Japanese garrison was completely eliminated. The intense combat on Tulagi sharply contrasted with the easy advance on Guadalcanal. There, on the morning of August 8th, Marines reached the edge of the airfield that would be named Henderson Field, after a pilot killed at Midway, and they began to develop a growing contempt for the enemy. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one Marine remarked within earshot of Richard Tregiscus, the International News Service correspondent who had accompanied the invasion. "All they do is run into the jungle." On the surface, the Marines could not have asked for an easier campaign. Yet the officers felt uneasy that second afternoon. It was almost too easy. At sea, the Americans encountered little opposition. A few Japanese patrol craft, tenders, and one or two transports had been caught off the shore and destroyed in the opening hours by shelling and bombing. Only in the air did the Japanese present a real challenge. Most of the first waves of bombers were destroyed, but engaging the Zeros had cost 21 of Admiral Fletcher's 99 carrier planes. Though not a high loss by operational standards, it reinforced Fletcher's belief that his decision to withdraw was justified. At 6 p.m., Fletcher requested permission from Admiral Gormley to pull back his carriers, and withdrew before receiving a reply. When Turner intercepted the dispatch, he realized the carrier withdrawal would leave him with no air cover. The number of Japanese aircraft could be expected to rise sharply as reinforcements arrived through the island chain. Meanwhile, the Japanese were moving in force. When the word, invasion, reached Rabaul from Guadalcanal, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa reacted immediately. Commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, Mikawa was responsible for the entire South Pacific operation. His first move was to load 6 small transports with troops and send them with destroyer escorts to reinforce the 2,000-man Guadalcanal garrison. However, the convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, operating out of Australia after the fall of the Philippines. The S-38 sank the transport Maomaru, with 342 men aboard. Coupled with reports of the massive American invasion fleet, this convinced Mikawa that reinforcing the garrison immediately was too risky, and he recalled the remaining transports. By then, Japanese naval reinforcements were already en route to Guadalcanal. Mikawa had been fortunate with timing. Early on the morning of August 7th, as the Tulagi garrison sent its last message, 5 heavy cruisers departed cavying at the northern tip of New Ireland. 3 headed northeast for Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, and 2 were bound for Rabaul. Mikawa quickly ordered all 5 to converge on Rabaul. Shortly after noon, the cruiser Chokai, accompanied by a destroyer, entered Simpson Harbor. The remaining 4 cruisers waited in St. George's Channel, between New Ireland and New Britain, for the Chokai to rejoin. Late that afternoon, Chokai arrived carrying Admiral Mikawa himself, accompanied by the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari. The Japanese force now numbered 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, moving south toward Guadalcanal. As they sped forward, Mikawa devised his battle plan. By cutting speed, they could delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8th, allowing a surprise night attack on the American beachhead. He knew the Americans had several carriers nearby, while he had none. A night attack would shield his forces from American planes, since the U.S. had no record of proficiency in night aerial operations, and in fact, no record of competence in any kind of night naval action, which had become a Japanese specialty. Mikawa's challenge that afternoon was to approach Guadalcanal without arriving too early and still preserve the element of surprise. The attack was intended to support the island defenders, but if executed with surprise, it could be devastatingly effective. The Admiral did not yet know that the Americans' divided command, the weaknesses of their air intelligence, and the lack of systematic search methods would all play directly into his hands. For intelligence on Japanese ship movements, the Americans at Guadalcanal had to rely on air reconnaissance and submarine reports. The observations of coast watchers were rarely useful for tracking naval operations, except under the most special circumstances. Early on August 7th, US B-17 Army bombers sighted the Japanese cruisers moving toward Rabaul. Later that evening, as the Mikawa force emerged from St. George's Channel, the submarine S-38 also reported contact. That night, the S-38 commander relayed the information to Brisbane. Despite these sightings, American naval commanders gave the reports little credence. Rabaul was the Japanese Navy's forward base, and ship movements in and out were considered routine. There was no indication that these ships were headed toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley, responsible for coordinating all elements of the American attack, depended on multiple sources for air searches. First were the long-range B-17 bombers of General MacArthur's American Army Air Force and the Australian Army Air Force, operating independently under MacArthur. Second was Admiral McCain's land-based Naval Air Force, which included seaplane tenders and PBY patrol bombers. MacArthur's planes were tasked with covering the Bismarck Islands, focusing on the major naval and air base Everbowel, while McCain's forces watched the northern approaches, including Truk and the Marshall Islands. Admiral Fletcher's carrier planes were nominally responsible for short-range searches, but in reality, they performed none, leaving him largely unconcerned. Admiral Turner, reviewing his charts, noted the Japanese had a clear approach to Guadalcanal along the west coast of Bougainville, passing between Choiseul Island and Vella La Vella, past Columbangara, between New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and finally between Florida Island and the north coast of Guadalcanal. This waterway would later be known in American naval history as the Slot. On the morning of August 8th, 4 PBYs were scheduled to fly a 700-mile triangular pattern with its apex near the Fiji Islands, approaching almost due west of Santa Cruz Island. 6 PBYs from Espiritu Santo would search northeast over the Santa Cruz Islands and terminate slightly west of the Bismarcks. Another 6 PBYs from Malaita would cover the Slot, searching north and west of it, while 3 B-17s were to search north of Guadalcanal. However, when Turner reviewed the plan on the night of August 7th, he discovered that the Slot, the most obvious approach for any enemy naval force to Guadalcanal, was completely uncovered. He requested a special search from Admiral McCain the next day, but the message was somehow lost in transmission between Turner's flagship, McCain's headquarters, and the seaplane tender Mackinac at Malaita. The search was never conducted. As a result, on August 8th, the Americans had left the most critical and predictable approach to Guadalcanal entirely unmonitored. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. See you in the next video.